Good evening. My name is John Stafford, and as Keegan said, I'm on the executive board of the 37 District Democrats. I'm on the boards of 2 climate change advocacy groups. I write articles for the South Seattle Emerald. I do deliver presentations like this to several community groups and districts outside the city. Or outside the district, I should say. And I know Kathy, and she has invited me to present a couple times at the Rainier Beach Community Council, and I appreciate it. I'm also a candidate for state representative this year for the state legislature in the 37th district. This presentation covers the Washington State Legislature last year, and I'll also discuss some implications for 2021. And I'm going to go through the slides at a pretty quick pace because I don't have a lot of time allotted to me. But I'm pleased to answer questions at the end, and also I will send the slides to Kathy. So if you want to look at some of the information later, you can do that. So we're going to look at 3 topics today. First, I'm going to cover an overview of the 2020 state legislative session. We'll talk about the progress on public policy last year, and then finally implications for 2021. So starting with last year, just context, I think most people probably know this, but it's important to cover just in case. Washington State operates on a biennium basis, so everything's done on a 2-year cycle. Let's take odd years. Let's take 2019 and let's take 2021. Those are long sessions that last 105 days in Olympia. And during those sessions, the legislators create budgets. And I'll talk about that in just a second. And then in the even years, so 2020 was an even year, and 2022, of course, will be. Those are short sessions, only 60 days. And what they do is they make modifications to the budget that was created in the odd year. So 2019, they created a full set of budgets, and the last session, 2020, was a short session in which those are modified. And that's sort of the point of the second bullet point. There's 3 budgets: the operating budget, which is the main one. There's also a transportation budget and a capital budget. We'll be focusing on the operating budget this evening. Those are created in the long sessions, the odd years, and modified in the short sessions, as I just said. And that in addition to the budget work, there's also several thousand bills introduced each session, of which a relatively low percentage pass. So it's sort of useful to think of the legislative session as budgetary and bills. And because of all this activity, obviously, it's very difficult to summarize in 15 or 20 minutes, but that's what I'm going to seek to do. Okay, so let's talk about the budget. So the first thing that's critical to know is that the pandemic-driven recession that we're in is devastating the state's finances, and it's for 2 reasons. One is Olympia will receive far less state revenue than it expected to receive because we're not buying as many things. So there's less sales tax going to Olympia, far less. And at the same time, expenses are going up in Olympia for things like unemployment compensation, for public health expenses, mental health expenses. So during the pandemic recession, revenues come down and expenses go up, and that is a devastating thing for the finances, of course. And in addition, unlike the federal government, we have to balance our budget each year. We can't just finance with debt. Equally importantly, this wasn't anticipated when they wrote the budget. So when they were in Olympia in the beginning of 2020, here's a quote from Steve O'Ban, a state senator. I'm not picking on him because basically everyone thought the same thing. His quote is, "As work continues in Olympia toward adopting a new supplemental budget to fund state operations, the legislature finds itself in the enviable position of having far more money than expected." Okay, so those are famous last words because shortly after this, the pandemic hit in full force, and now we have way less money than expected. But the point is, the budget was created thinking that the economic outlook was sound. Now we have an $8.8 billion revenue shortfall in Olympia over the next 3 years, which is a huge amount. So I'll elaborate on this point that I made just a minute ago. When on the left side shows what the outlook was in February of 2020. So when our state legislators were in Olympia, they thought that the forecasted growth rate that they were operating under the assumption of was that in 2020, there'd be almost 2% economic growth, and next year there'd be almost 2%. So they built a budget around these assumptions. And if you'll recall, the unemployment rate at that time was about 3.8%. Well, they finished the budget and left Olympia. Then the pandemic came, and now there's a new forecast for almost negative 6% growth. So that's an 8% drop compared to expectation. And next year they're projecting it to be 4%. If that ends up being worse than that figure, we'll even have a bigger problem. And the unemployment rate in May was over 15%. It's come down a little bit since. But the point is, we built a budget under these assumptions, and this is what reality is going to be, and that's a huge problem. So what does that mean for revenue? Well, here's the operating budget. So when they were in Olympia in 2019, so you'll recall this is an odd year when they created the two-year budget, they created a two-year $52.4 billion budget. Then they came into Olympia this year, 2020, to make some tweaks to it, and they actually added about $1 billion of spending because they didn't think that they were in the midst of an emergency. So we increased spending at a time when it would have been far more desirable to not do that. When Governor Inslee signed the two-year budget, he took some spending out because he now knew that there was a problem when we signed a $53 billion budget over 2 years. And now we have a new revenue forecast, spread over 3 years. But now the projection for these 2 years is $48 billion of revenue. So we have significant, a significant budget problem in Olympia. And it's even exceeding that of the Great Recession, 2007 to 2009. So we should all be prepared as citizens for a very, very difficult session in Olympia. Okay, so just finishing, or that's my last point, at least for now, on the budget. And that's the first main theme of my talk, is that, there's a budget disaster and a pending very difficult legislative session in Olympia. My second point regarding the 2020 session is, in my view, and I write on these each year and I give them a grade, and I gave this last session a D, and I gave the session before that an A-, and I'll explain why. In the 2019 session, there was a whole host of very momentous bills passed. So there was a lot of structural change in the state. For example, a bill for climate change to have the state operate on 100% renewable energy by 2045 passed. In K-12 education, the McCleary process was completed. For college and university finance, we instituted the Washington Need Grant, or Washington College Grant, which guarantees financial assistance in the state to everyone with need. So we became sort of a national leader there, and in climate change. Healthcare, we instituted the public option called Cascade Care and became a national leader there. Mental health, we're moving from Eastern state and Western state to community health centers. That's going to eventually save money and put mental health out closer to people. Gun control, there were 10 bills passed. Elections, we moved to prepaid mail-in ballots. The point is, it was a very, very consequential session. A lot of people said it's one of the most momentous legislative sessions in memory. So as I say, I was also very impressed. I'm liberal. This year, I'm going to argue there weren't any structural changes made in Olympia. Yes, there were bills passed, and we'll talk about that, but nothing that really restructured how we operate. So I thought this was a very disappointing session, both for budgetary and bill reasons. Okay. And I'll just add one point to that. It's especially disappointing to me and to others because we have a trifecta, meaning that the Democratic Party controls the governorship and the House by a considerable margin, 57-41, and the Senate, 28-21. So it controls all three chambers. So one would think that it would be possible to pass some reasonably momentous legislation, as it was in 2019. But for whatever reasons, that's not the approach that the party or the legislature took this year. So a summary. The budgets do not leave the state well prepared for 2021. There's a huge revenue shortfall, $9 billion almost over 3 years. The session lacked vision and meaningful progress, no major structural change. There's no new source of revenue, which I'll talk about in a moment, meaning taxation. Insufficient progress in climate change, and I just considered it a timid session. As I said, I graded as a D, and I'm not always a hard grader. Last year I was very impressed. So that's my summary, focusing on the budget and on structural change. And now we'll get into some specifics in a couple of different policy areas. I'm going to cover climate change or taxation and climate change in a little detail, and then cover other areas in sort of a broader sense. Tax policy. So we'll start with that. And this becomes important because now we have this budget deficit. So taxation becomes a more relevant discussion. Probably everybody knows these things, but just briefly, we don't have an income tax. Most states do. That makes us regressive because we rely on a sales tax. We don't have a capital gains tax. Same thing, makes us regressive. We rely on the sales tax, makes us regressive. Our businesses are taxed on revenues, not profits. That makes us regressive. And so we have the most regressive tax system in the country, which I'll talk about momentarily. And for many people, myself included, that means it's just critical that the state introduce a progressive tax on high-income individuals. So regarding our tax structure, so on the left, this side of the chart deals with level of taxation in Washington state. This side of the chart deals with regressivity, how regressive we are. So let's start on the left. These bars show the total amount that a citizen pays. Let's say Kathy, as a percent of $1,000, as relative to $1,000 of personal income. So in Washington state, if we added up all of Kathy's tax bills, sales tax, property tax, fees, et cetera, it'd be about $95 per $1,000 of personal income, and the US average is about $105. So we're about 10% below, which gives us a rank of 32nd out of 50 states. And with regressivity, this is the percent of the income, state and local income, that different groups of people pay in taxes. And our lowest 20% of our citizens, that's the lowest 20%, they pay almost 18% of their income in state and local taxes, whereas the US average is only 11. There's no state where this number is higher. So our poorest citizens or lowest income citizens pay a higher percent of their income than they do in any other state. So sort of summarizing, we're below average in terms of tax intensity, and we're the worst state in the country in terms of tax regressivity. And both of these sort of speak to the need for a new tax that's progressive. So summary, our level of taxation is low. We have the most regressive tax structure in the nation because we don't have an income tax or capital gains tax. Most states have both. We are regularly evaluated as having the most unjust tax system in the nation, according to for a variety of groups, including the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy. We do need, in my view and the view of many analysts, a new form of progressive taxation for two reasons: to address the budget deficit. We have an $8.8 billion deficit as over 3 years, and also to make the system regressive. And Frank Chop, whom you'll all know, he was the Speaker of the House for the Democratic Party. Now he's a representative, but he's introduced a three-pronged tax program for the 2021 session. One of those prongs is a new capital gains tax. So I'm supporting his general approach. I'm not sure it's perfect, but it moves in the right direction. It's a $2 billion a year tax proposal, and you'll recall that it's about a $3 billion a year deficit, or $9 billion over 3 years. So this would go a long ways to meeting the deficit needs. So that's in the works. We'll see if that passes. Okay, so moving from taxation to climate change, we should be a national leader in climate change policy. And why do I say that? I say that because we have an abundance of hydropower, which reduces our cost of becoming a green energy state, because so much of our power is already green. And there's also synergistic benefits to sort of a solid West Coast block of climate committed governments. And all of these are pretty progressive in terms of climate policy. But when you have a block of states, you can start to institute policies that are similar or identical across jurisdictions. Even things like a carbon tax can be regional. So this is happening on the East Coast and now on the West Coast, and it's important for us to, keep up with other states, if not be a leader here. And then my final point, which I'm going to go into, is, in my view, it's useful to think of climate change policy in two categories. One is incremental changes, which are great. But perhaps more importantly are breakthrough changes, things that really make a huge difference. So let's look at where Washington State stands on these major breakthrough policies. And the first thing I'll say, this is a list of 10 policies. These aren't John Stafford's policies. These are best practices policies based on from domestic and international, states and countries. So all we do, I develop this with other people, but is, read what other states are doing and write down the most momentous things that are happening elsewhere. So of the 10, I've commented on where Washington State stands on each. You'll see we've only passed 2, 4 we've introduced but not passed, and 4 we really haven't done anything on yet. So what are they? 100% renewable electric grid with coal made illegal for electricity production. That happened in 2019. That's a huge bill, huge bill. Make coal illegal. Those go hand in hand. So that's huge. Implement a statewide price on carbon. That's been introduced in the state but not passed. There's a bill that's been introduced to ban the sale of new internal combustion engines starting in 2030, so that you would no longer be able to buy an ICE vehicle. That's been introduced but not passed. Institute mandatory K-12 climate change curriculum statewide. I'm a high school teacher and for Mercer Island High School. Before that, I was a substitute teacher for Seattle schools. I think the average citizen would be shocked at how little attention climate change gets in our schools. So in my view, nothing could be better than having 1.3 million school kids learning every day about the science of climate change. And in fact, New Jersey very recently passed the first bill in the country calling for, mandatory K-12 climate change on a daily basis through a variety of disciplines. A very impressive bill, and we should seek to emulate that, in my opinion. Make fossil fuel infrastructure illegal. There was a partial bill to do that, but it didn't pass. Requiring fleets to be electric, creating tax incentivized green business clusters, divest from fossil fuel companies, support investment in renewable energy, etc. So, we've done a couple things, and these are big, but we have a long ways to go. And the next slide will look dense, and I will not cover it in detail. It's just to show what happened last year in Olympia. So I've divided bills. This summarizes sort of all the main bills in Olympia this last year, and I've divided them between major and minor bills and whether they passed or didn't pass. And this sort of gets to my theme, consistent with my theme, that not that much major structural change happened in Olympia. So we did pass a zero emission vehicle mandate that requires electric vehicle manufacturers to sell a higher percentage of the cars in Washington. We did pass a bill for new state standards for greenhouse gas emissions, calling for Washington to be net zero by 2050. And we passed a bill on sustainable farms calling for carbon sequestration programs in rural areas. So these are all great, but some bigger ones didn't pass. I won't go through these because they were pretty much all on the last list. And then there's some minor bills that passed. They're important. Some bills on solar power, etc., and some minor ones that didn't pass. But overall, not a really momentous session in terms of climate change. Okay. What should priorities be for 2021? So if we come back to the budget and we realize that we have this big deficit, we have a public health problem, etc., climate change isn't going to naturally rise to the top of the agenda of things that people are focused on. But it needs to be. This is an urgent problem that needs to be addressed. So how do we address that sort of dilemma? And my proposal, very straightforward, simple, is that we need to propose high impact programs that cost very little, because if they cost a lot, they're not going to be implemented when there's a large budget deficit. So what are 5 bills that are high impact but low cost? First, declare a climate emergency in Washington State. That was a bill last year, but it didn't pass. Pass the Clean Fuels Bill to require transportation fuels to have a lower carbon content. That's been introduced 2 years in a row, passed the House 2 years in a row, but not the Senate. Passed the Healthy Environment for All Act, or HEAL Act, introduced by Rebecca Saldana in our legislative district, that calls for ensuring that climate bills serve the needs of low-income and minority communities who are most impacted by climate change. Fourth, mandatory K-12 climate change curriculum, which I just talked about. That happened in New Jersey. That obviously is, all of these are low cost. The final one isn't low cost, ban the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles. But the reason I include that is the costs don't come till later. This wouldn't be till 2030 or some such year. So the point is, we can do a lot of really important things in climate this session without taking the focus off the recession and the pandemic. That's the point. Okay, other bills. I just will touch on these. So we've talked about taxation, we've talked about climate, a number of other bills passed. One of the themes I think conclusions I think you'll come to looking at this is, yes, there's some good bills, but these aren't massively consequential. At least that would be my view. You might have a different view. So we're going to have K-12 sex education in the curriculum. That's being challenged by some rural district. We've implemented some tenant eviction restrictions so that tenants, low-income individuals, aren't evicted during the COVID crisis. That's, of course, very important. Some extra funding for the coronavirus response, protections for orcas, cap on the cost of insulin for individuals at $100 a month, a couple gun control bans, etc., ban private prisons. So some good things. I support all these bills, but yet not as big as some years. And then bills that didn't pass. There's a type of bill in Olympia called a title-only bill. So let's say I'm a legislator, and I know that there's some deadlines coming up for me having to introduce and pass bills. I can create a blank bill, and let's just call it the Stafford bill. There's nothing on it except the title. I pass it, and then later, right before the session ends, now I fill it in with some content, and then it gets to be voted on. It's a way to skirt the rules. And I personally think that should be illegal, but it wasn't made illegal. Let's see, banning the death penalty and felony voting rights. Those did not pass this year. And a couple big failures on gun control. There was a bill to limit the capacity of magazines. That was not passed. A bill to ban assault weapons. That was not passed. A bill to look into a 2-year pilot program to test universal basic income. That wasn't passed. A bill to prevent immigration officers from making arrests within a mile of courthouses. That wasn't passed. So I would have liked to have seen a lot more of these bills be passed as well. So again, in my view, not huge, some very important bills. I mean, tenant eviction restrictions, there's a lot of things here that I am strongly in favor of, but I don't think it was a bold agenda. And I also would have liked to have seen more bills passed. Okay, so my last 2 slides, implications for this upcoming year, sort of thematic implications. First, I think it is important to reflect on the obvious. We are facing 5 concurrent crises. I mean, these are hugely consequential times. They're sad times, they're difficult times, they're painful times, but it's also an important time provided we respond in a meaningful way. So what are those crises that I'm referring to? The public health crisis of the pandemic, the economic crisis of the recession. These 2, of course, sort of contribute to a 3rd crisis, which I didn't, or I'll call it 2A, which I didn't put up here, but both of these impact lower income and minority communities disproportionately, and that creates a sort of crisis. 3rd crisis, the nearly $9 billion budget shortfall in Olympia, which may require cuts to the people being hurt most by the recession and public health. That's highly concerning. We have the demands for racial justice from Black Lives Matter, in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing, and these need to be taken very seriously. And finally, we have climate change. And I teach my students, I teach AP US history and other classes at the high school level, that in my personal view, I will argue this is one of the 4 most consequential times in US history. You might disagree with that. And in no particular order, those would be the American Revolution, the Civil War, World War II, and now. And not any one of these things would necessarily qualify this era for being one of the 4, but concurrently, I think if you look at these, it's hard not to be quite concerned, in my opinion, especially with the level of political dysfunction we have, which leads to questions of how capable are we as a society of addressing these. So in my view, we need bold structural change. We need big proposals. We need to make sure that we're addressing these issues structurally, not just with Band-Aids. And 4 things that I'd like to see happen in the next session. First of all, balance the budget without austerity. So rather than cutting funding for low-income programs like we did during the Great Recession, when higher education and things like welfare, which is TANF, of course, and foster programs, it's better to go about it the following way, in my opinion. First of all, we have a little over $3 billion in the rainy day fund. And if this isn't the rainy day, I'm not sure what is. So most analysts are arguing to take, $900 million or $1 billion in the first year out of that. So that takes us a third of the way. I'll get to taxation in a minute. We can also restructure some of our operations. What do I mean by that? So let's just talk about mental health. I mentioned that we're moving from a model with 2 central facilities to a decentralized model. Well, can we accelerate that to the point that we can eliminate one of the central facilities and save some money while doing the much needed decentralizing at the same time? How about for universities? This isn't my idea, but I think it's a good idea. What if the University of Washington offers a blended approach, but with massive online open courses that have 2 tiers of participants? One are the students of the classes, and then one is the general public who pay a lower rate and don't receive grading and assignments, but can still participate in the class. That would help defray revenue needs at the university. If the university is operating on a blended model, that will open up some facility capacity. Could that capacity be used for, let's say, for example, job retraining programs that the state needs to pursue? We have excess stadium capacity. Maybe can one of the stadiums be used for micro housing to address the homeless crisis, which is burgeoning during the downturn. So some of these ideas are mine, some are other people's, and there's others. The point is these should be looked at prior to spending cuts. So rainy day fund, operations restructuring. I do support hiring freezes and furloughs and salary freezes, not because I'm in favor of these things, but because by doing those things, we can avoid program cuts. Those should be the lowest priority. So that's sort of my conceptual view of the budget. There should be no universal program. So some people have said now's the time for universal basic income. And, Paul Krugman wrote an article on this that I totally agree with. Now's the exact wrong time for universal programs. They should not be sending me, who is fortunate enough to have my job and health care, et cetera, a monthly check when there's people who are facing program cuts that are in dire need. So this is, intelligent people can debate universal programs, but now is certainly not the right time. And then finally, there's a couple of new programs that I do support. And one is a $100 million fund to support the needs of undocumented immigrants. This was proposed by the Seattle City Council, and this would help cover healthcare costs, eviction costs, et cetera, for people who can't easily go to the authorities for benefits because they may not qualify. So that's my view on budget needs. We also need new progressive taxation. I do support the Frank Chop approach. That, of course, will also significantly help the budget situation. We need to aggressively address the climate change situation. I've talked about 5 specific bills. And we need to address the racial justice demands. I certainly don't support, quote unquote, defunding of the police, especially if that's taken literally, but I do support police reforms, criminal justice reforms, and I support reforms that get at the underlying societal inequities between the races. So that's sort of my view of the conceptual priorities for the upcoming legislative session. Obviously, there's a lot of work that has to happen to go from these sort of conceptual points to specific bills that can pass, but it is important to start with a conceptual framework. So those are my thoughts on 2020 and implications for 2021. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you. I enjoy delivering these presentations. It's interesting work to me, and I'm pleased to share it with other people. I will send the slides to Kathy, and I don't know what your agenda is, but if there is time available, I'm happy to answer questions or do my best to now. And if there's not time, that's fine also. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. There is some time for questions if people have them.
I have a question. So with the trifecta legislature, why couldn't you get those bills passed that you listed?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I would argue that really we should be able to get the bills passed. But I'll bring up one thing. So here's the slide. So this is it's a trifecta in an aggregate sense, but if you get more detailed into this, let's just say a tax increase as one of any number of examples. So if you go to, our district would tend to be empathetic to this, although there's certainly a variety of different opinions. But let's say you go to the 5th legislative district, Mark Mullet's district. He will argue, and I've heard him argue this, that if he as a candidate in most years proposes, he's a Democrat, if he proposes a tax increase, that's the end of his political career. So the point being, there's majorities at an aggregate level, but on a bill by bill level, those can sometimes, not always, but sometimes dissolve. So it does require getting into things in a little bit more detail. So that, I think, is the best answer. And, candidly, it's sort of a little bit of a criticism of my own party. I do feel that the Democratic Party in our state and in our district stands to be a bit bolder. I observe at the national level the Republican Party, who, in my view, is pursuing a whole host of very inappropriate policies, climate change, immigration, racist policies, in my view. They're very bold about it. And Democrats who, I think have, given my politics, I like their views, far more, tend to be more timid. And I feel like that's unfortunate and not appropriate. So I would answer your question with those two dimensions or those two thoughts.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
I have one question. With the idea of introducing a tax at the state level for high income earners, how would that interact with the bill recently passed by Seattle?
Yeah, that's a great question. So they passed the Mosqueda tax in Seattle, and both of these taxes are conceptually the same, or at least similar. And the way they work is that the entity identifies large profitable corporations and then specifically only taxes high income earners within those corporations. So the Mosqueda tax, let's say I worked for Amazon, once you earn $150,000 a year, then a tax, I think it's 0.7% of my salary gets levied against Amazon. So it's not a tax on any lower income, anything lower than 150,000. And it goes up, there's another, I think it's 400,000, then it goes up even further. So it's a tax on high income individuals. The CHOPS is exactly the same, so it's a good question. His starts at 500,000. So the tax is only taxing really high income earners. And, of course, it does raise the question of should these be happening at the same time, et cetera. The Mosqueda plan does have a sunset provision. And one of the reasons for the sunset provision is if the state does enough, then you can sunset the Seattle bill. But if it doesn't, then you can leave it in place in Seattle. So they've built in sort of a mechanism to allow for that, so that they don't, so they avoid banking on something happening at the state level and then it not happening. And a similar thing could be said about capital gains. Frank Chop, one third of his proposal is a capital gains tax, and Andrew Lewis on the Seattle City Council is also proposing a capital gains tax. And again, he's talking about the fact that, we have to revisit this in light of what happens at the state level. So good question. And it's sort of a fluid situation, and both entities are sort of, looking at the same types of taxes.
Great. Thank you.
Yep. Anybody else? Okay.
I have a question about the university suggestion of having the classes live, in person, and online.
Mm-hmm.
Would that mess with the student visas of our students that come in from other countries? Because that brings in a really huge income for the universities.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I saw that Trump just passed a law that says if you're in online courses, there's repercussions for that. You can't be deemed to be, I can't remember the exact designation, but you're right. So the question is, if they were all online, it would certainly trigger that provision. If they're blended and they're part-time in class, part-time online, my sense is that it wouldn't trigger that provision and that they would be okay, but I'm not sure about that. And it's a very, very good question. Very good question. I'll need to look into that. Anybody else? Okay, wonderful. Thank you again, and I'll just, if it's okay with Kathy and company, I'll just stay for the rest of the meeting, and I will follow, send the slides along. So thank you very much.